Welcome to Dyscastia, a podcast for parents and educators about the best way to support kids living with learning difficulties. I'm Michael Shanahan.
And I'm Bill Hansberry.
What are we talking about today, Bill?
Michael, we are starting, probably not on the easiest of topics, a deep dive into, what we call this stuff of learning difficulty, learning disability, learning disorders. We're going to kind of go deeply into, well, what's the language around this and what type of language is okay, and I guess when is it okay?
Yeah, and why? Why does language matter?
Well, that's right. So I guess before we get into it, I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, Michael, here in sunny, we're at Blackwood.
Blackwood, yeah.
So, and we're only here, I guess, by the good graces of the people who are the traditional custodians who allow us to walk on their land.
Here.
Yeah.
Well said.
Right. So, shall we roll into it then?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, in talking, Michael, three different types of terminology have sprung already, haven't they?
Yep.
Learning difference, learning disability, learning disorder. And we hear them used interchangeably. I want to know what your thinking is on that and where you might use each and whether we have to stick to one.
Well, I think there's two parts to it for me. The first part is what I might prefer. So as someone living with a learning difficulty myself,
yes,
or disability or disorder, or a dyslexia,
yes,
dysgraphia,
dyscalculia.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot of terms. I think there's two ways to look at it. I think, what do I think personally about it? Like, what's my personal preference? And I think everyone would have a different personal preference. And that's diversity, isn't it? You know,
well, it is,
people have what they're comfortable with. And then there's the official terminology, like if you get a diagnosis from an educational psychologist, you get an official label for it.
Well, is it a diagnosis or an identification?
Or
because
an
I've been pulled up on that myself
too.
Right,
so, yeah. And then there is what might be best for the community as a whole. Because I think labels have an impact on mental health.
Yes.
And our self-identity, and particularly if you're a kid. You know, you're in a vulnerable space. You're trying to form ideas about who you are as a person.
Yeah.
And I think in those circumstances, language does matter.
The microphone probably picked up my very audible out-breath then, my almost sigh on that when you went into the space around labels, mental health, and then what that means for our kids. Michael, we're both specialist dyslexia or learning difficulty practitioners. We've had these conversations with parents about should my child know that there is a formal identification here, and we're both teachers as well by background. Now, part of the culture of teaching was don't label. Number one, because it's above our pay rate to label. We're not educational psychs. But the other ideological bit about it was, what does happen to a kid emotionally when you put a label on them? Now, I don't know about you, but I have done an absolute 180 on that.
Right.
Now that I work in this area.
So what was your thought previously?
Well, don't label. Don't put kids in a corner.
And then what changed your mind?
The natural and understandable assumptions that young people with difficulties that are very apparent to them and apparent to others, the natural assumptions they make about the reasons for those difficulties, and without the proper knowledge, most kids I've worked with would just assume that they're dumb.
Yeah.
You know?
That's kind of the choice you've got, isn't it?
Yes.
Either I'm dumb.
Yes.
Or what? What's the alternative?
That's right, because I actually have no language or knowledge to explain the reason that the other kids in my class, if we're talking about dyslexia, are flying through those levelled readers and are picking up this broad skill set that we call reading seemingly effortlessly.
Yep.
But here I am still on this wretched level, whatever it is, not moving.
Yeah.
And if I don't know the nuts and bolts of the reason I'm not moving, then I'm going to call myself dumb. I don't know. I can't think of any other thing that you'd say to yourself in that situation.
No, I think that's true. I certainly remember my son when because I love stories and I love reading, and so does my wife. And so it was exciting having a kid and thinking, I can't wait for them to read.
Yeah.
I can't wait for them to discover these magical worlds. And then he couldn't.
Yep.
And he got to the point where he was saying, what's wrong with me?
Yeah.
He was in year 2
Yeah.
and he was saying, all the other kids can read. What's wrong with me? Why can't I read?
Yeah.
And back then, I didn't even know what dyslexia was.
Yeah.
This was my introduction to it, even though subsequently I discovered I'm dyslexic.
Yes.
And so that was a moment of, what do we do?
Yes.
Because we were parents who read religiously every night, because I loved reading to the kids. It was part of the whole routine. So, this parental guilt comes in of well, is it my fault, blah, 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 blah. And so I think from that perspective, had there not been a diagnosis or an identification and a label and someone saying, here's what it is.
It's the thing.
Here's what it is. It was emotional and it was hard. But at the same time, it was okay, now that it's got a name, we've got some strategies. There is actually something we can do here to remediate it and, help him out, because he was really struggling psychologically because school is so much about reading, isn't it?
Michael, number one, thank you for that. That's raw. But that is the experience that you and I live, I guess, through other parents as well. In our practices, as you were talking, I was remembering there's a beautiful little YouTube clip by a young man who's local in South Australia that was put together by Mark Lemessurier. And the young fella, his name is Tim Mackey, and in this, and you can get this on YouTube, if you just YouTube, I don't want to be here anymore. There was a point where Tim's mum was reflecting on Tim, I think, being in year maybe 2. Tim had the same realisation your lad had, that this was hard, didn't know why. And his mother tearily said, Tim looked at me and said, Mum, you can't help me. Nobody can help me because I'm never going to be able to learn how to read.
It's so sad.
It's the desperation.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so sad because it's such a big thing. And so, I think of it from that perspective. And you can see I'm still emotional about it. And this is he's 19 now.
The scar tissue runs thick and deep, Michael. Yeah. So we've gone down the rabbit hole, which is probably a topic for a podcast all on its own about the damage that this does, but not just to kids, Michael, to their parents, because it's a desperate and powerless position to be in when your bright, bubbly, verbally intelligent kid who went happily off to school all of a sudden grinds to a halt, because it is all about print.
Yes.
At school, particularly in the beginning. So, okay, we have these lucky families who can get an identification, and if they can't, some lucky families have a teacher willing to stick their neck out and say, you know what, I reckon you should look at this. I reckon you should maybe get an assessment. And then the very, very lucky kids are in schools that go, look, it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck. We're pretty sure it's dyslexia and we're going to chuck him into intervention regardless.
I think that's so important because our experience was, and there's no blame game here because I didn't know what dyslexia was back then.
No.
And so the teacher was saying, don't worry, he'll catch up. Some kids take longer, don't worry, he'll catch up.
Yeah.
But if I could, go back and give myself advice, I'd think, no, hold on a sec. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah,
it's better to go in, get an assessment, find out where you're at, because you'll quickly discover whether it's dyslexia or not.
Yeah.
At least then you've got a roadmap, but kind of the longer you leave it, the harder it gets.
And I guess I just want to shout out to teachers and schools listening to this. From the perspective of a couple of practitioners, the time lost by teachers not keen to say what's on their mind to parents is really important time. We know that there's this kind of year 3, year 4 cutoff that if a youngster doesn't get a good intervention before that, it is so much harder to normalise their reading.
Not impossible.
Not impossible,
You can still do it, but it's harder.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's an important message. But And when teachers do say this to a parent, they stick their neck out. Teachers will still tell me I would get a slap across the hand from a leader for saying this, because the leader would say we can't diagnose.
Yep.
That's not a diagnosis. That's just saying there's something going on here.
Yeah. It's a suggestion. It's an observation.
Yeah, that's right.
And what harm could there come from an investigation of that?
That's right. So if you find out it's not dyslexia, what else is it?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So we'd better get ourselves, I guess, into this conversation about the labels, Michael. So disorder, disability, difference. Let's start with
difference.
Do you want to start with difference?
Sure.
Okay. Tell us. Tell me what you're thinking.
I personally don't like difference because I don't think, learning difference, they often say.
Yes.
So it's that learning difference that I don't agree with, because I don't think kids living with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia learn differently. I don't think they do.
Yeah.
I think they learn exactly the same as everybody else does.
Yes.
They maybe need more time and practice because it's more difficult for them.
Yeah.
But it's the same for anyone. You know, some people have natural talent at tennis.
Yes.
They can pick up a tennis racket and they can go and have a rally.
Yes.
Someone else picks up a tennis racket and they might immediately drop it, or the ball comes and they totally miss it.
Yes.
Like, they've got to work harder to get good at it.
Yes.
But they don't learn tennis differently.
No.
It's the same learning process.
A good
you just
forehand
have different starting.
looks the same.
Yep.
A good topspin backhand looks the same. A good kick serve looks the same. The skills that make them up are different. It's just some kids tend to pick it up by looking at it and watching it, and some kids need that skill set taken apart into its small pieces and each taught well. With lots of practice.
Exactly.
I'm glad you went there.
So I don't think that's different.
I'm glad you went there, because when you look at the stages that young people pass through, reading development stages and spelling development stages, you are exactly right. They are the same. Whether you are a young person with a dyslexic profile or not, you are still going to have to pass through those well-established developmental stages for reading and for spelling. It's just that the dyslexic population are going to need, to use again the tennis method, they're going to need those skills broken up into a fine-grained way, taught in a logical sequence with much, much, much more practice or repeated exposures, as they say. Yeah,
lots of practice. And
so difference doesn't cut the mustard?
No, I don't think it's different.
No.
I think it's, I suppose you could look at a perspective where, you could argue that is different, because it takes more time. But I think the word difference there implies that you need a whole different approach or a different technique.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that just extra time or being more explicit counts as different.
And it is fraught, because then you are vulnerable. If you're going to talk about kids learning differently, and we know that learning styles have been debunked, and so they should be. But if you're going to subscribe to this every child learns differently business, I reckon you're very vulnerable to a heap of edu trends, I call them. Those things that come and go that once upon a time I so eagerly grabbed to try to make a difference for a kid. I think my opinion is it's the path into non-evidence-based teaching if we're going to do that. Okay, now that we've poo-pooed the term difference, why might it be attractive to some people, do you think?
The term difference? Because I think that sometimes it's used to make a kid feel better.
I think you're right.
About themselves, or an attempt to make them feel better about themselves. I'm not 100% sure it does, because I'm not sure that. Well, firstly, I'm not sure it's helpful, because we don't want to develop a way of thinking in a kid that turns into an excuse.
Yes.
Like,
we
don't want a kid to be thinking, I can't learn this because of the teacher's not teaching me the way that I need to learn.
Oh, that's another podcast.
What I mean? Yeah, that's another thing.
I'm glad you went there. Keep going.
So I'm not 100% sure that that's helpful to say learn differently. I think it's more helpful to be talking about the primary way that we do learn. And so I talk to my kids about asking questions. Like, that's a big one. When you're not sure about something, actually pipe up and say it and get good at that.
Yes.
And practice.
Yes.
Practice is the big one, isn't it? Like, first knowing what it is and then practicing it.
The right type of practice, though, Michael,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we know that just sending non-structured text home for kids and thinking that just reading more is going to be, you know, that's not what we're talking about.
Because they might be practicing the wrong things.
Exactly, they're practicing forced guessing.
Yeah. It's really hard to break that guessing habit once kids get to that stage.
Isn't it just?
Yeah.
Yes. We've got 3-queuing to thank for that, Michael. But that's or multi-queuing, which is completely disproven. So, okay. So we don't... so difference, probably we're thinking no. Something you said made me think understandably, a lot of the terminology parents use around kids, I think probably has a better job of helping a parent feel better than the youngster themselves, you know.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, but I think parental guilt has a big role to play in it. Parental guilt, teacher guilt.
Yes.
Because we feel helpless.
We do.
And we feel like, what have I done wrong?
That's right, or what could have I done?
And it's a natural thing to feel.
That's right.
Isn't it?
We who teach are kind of invested in kids, aren't we? Just kind of comes with the territory. Yeah,
well, every day if I teach something and a kid doesn't get it, straight away I think, okay, what have I done wrong?
Isn't that interesting, by the way, the whole flip from if it's the kid's fault if they don't get it to, oh no, it's on us.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that guilt is difficult, and I think sometimes the labels we use and the descriptions we use are designed to make us feel better about what's happening, so that we're not feeling guilty or like, it wasn't something I did as a parent, or it's not something I'm lacking as a teacher.
Yes.
It's an actual thing.
Yes, it is a thing.
It's an actual physiological.
Right. So neurodiversity is such a buzzword at the moment. I don't think it's helpful for all brains do different stuff. We get that.
Yep.
No two brains are exactly alike. However, we don't want to water down a specific learning difficulty or disorder, or here we are, but we don't want to water it down to, that's just a little bit of a difference.
Yeah. Because
that little difference, if we're going to call it that, has huge implications, doesn't it? Yeah. All right. Should we move on to disability?
Yes.
The other way that we can talk about this.
Yeah, well, what do you think about disability?
I know that understandably, parents want to avoid it like the plague, because we have very different mental images typically, don't we, when we hear the word disability, i.e. we're thinking physical disability, or that's where I go.
Yeah.
However, so no one wants to say to a kid, you aren't reading well because you are disabled.
Yeah.
Okay? That just is jarring, isn't it? Okay.
Because it's not the person that's disabled anyway. Even if you're talking disability, you wouldn't say that to anyone.
Let's go there then.
Yeah.
With, the groups I have spent time in, which Code Read used to be DAG Bags, Dyslexia SA, when we would talk to policymakers about dyslexia, in that setting, the word disability was what got the traction. So people kind of ask me, when do you use it? And I say it's probably a word in a political setting. When we are trying to convince people that this is real, it has huge, huge implications for people's life. This is illiteracy. So in that context, I've no trouble calling it a disability.
Well, that label is very useful from that perspective, because if you call it a disability, now you're falling under International Declaration of
the DDA,
the rights of the people who live with disability.
Yes.
And that gives you certain protections.
Yes. So where it has been awfully helpful is the kind of analogy, why wouldn't you give a child with dyslexia a good evidence-based intervention? And denying that would be like saying to a person in a wheelchair, no ramp for you.
Yeah, exactly.
If we talk about accessing education. But I want to bounce something off you. A future guest of ours once said to me, there is no such thing as a disability, only a disabling environment, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I thought,
it's that social view of disability.
Right, is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah. Because that's true, isn't it? The whole idea of disability is simply a construct.
Yes.
Because it's really a deviation from the norm. You know, so when we're talking about neurodiversity, everyone has a different brain. That's true.
Yeah.
But we all tend towards a particular pattern.
Yes.
And then there are people that fall outside that norm.
Yes. I'm imagining a bell curve, Michael.
Yeah,
yes.
that's right, on a spectrum.
Yes.
And so we all tend to kind of go to that norm, that spot. And because most of us are there, then I think most of society and our built infrastructure and everything we do is based around
the top of the bell
where
curve.
most of us are.
Yeah.
Because it's our
Yes.
personal perspective.
Yes.
And so then from inside that bell curve bubble,
Yep.
we're looking outside and going, you're different.
Yeah.
You know, let's give you a label, let's call it disability or whatever, because you can't use the steps, the beautiful steps that I've just created.
Yes. Yes.
But you see, that's just me saying, this is how it is,
Yeah.
and you're different. So that, to me, that's the social model, because it's like, well, where are the majority of people thinking, and what are the majority of people thinking?
Yeah.
And if you're outside of that, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
So if you look at it
Wow.
from that perspective, you think, okay, well, that is just a constructed reality, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's the experience of the majority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just unfortunate, well, you know, if you want to call it unfortunate, it's just that reading is such an enormous part of what kids do at school that if you're outside that norm and, you know, you have neurodiversity that means reading is hard, then we start saying that's a disability and so on. But, you know, we don't apply the same labels to someone that's bad at cooking, kicking a football or cooking a meal.
Yes.
You know, if you're a bad cook, we don't say you've got a disability.
You don't have this cookie.
Yeah, because it's not something that, you know, you have to pass and get examined on at school. I mean, in some subjects it is, but it's not so fundamental. So from that perspective, it's a construction, isn't it?
Well, it is. It is.
So, you know, prior to literacy in schools, dyslexia was not a disability.
Prior to a writing system.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's proof that it's a construction, isn't there? Because this has always been part of our diversity.
That's right.
It's just that now, you know, this particular thing that we find tricky becomes a cornerstone of education.
Wow. Oh, man, you're just blowing my mind on this. Probably need to qualify the last comment. Prior to a Phoenician alphabet, a sound-based writing system, it wasn't an issue. Yeah,
okay. That's right.
So, okay. So we've covered disorder, disability. No, we haven't. Sorry, we did difference and disability. Now we've got disorder left.
Yeah.
Tell me, when you hear disorder, if someone says dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, learning disorder, where do you go?
See, I don't like disorder.
Yeah.
And to me, this is, well, I don't like it, but I see the necessity for it.
Where might it be necessary?
Well, this is the official medical term. And so, you know, it's still like a diagnosis or an identification, whatever you want to call it. There's still a label that needs to be put on it. And traditionally, that kind of medical model of disability puts a label that is like a functional deficit. You know, they label it as something less or, you know, a functional deficit or a, what's the word we're talking about?
A disorder.
Disorder, yeah. So it's labelled as something that's wrong with you.
That is unordered, out of order.
Because that's their job.
Yes.
And that's the job of the medical person. You know, they assess you and they say, this is the disorder, this is what's wrong.
Yes.
Kind of like you're a mechanic and you focus and you say, this is what's wrong with your car.
Yes.
It's that very logical, you know, professional.
Yes.
Here you go. Here's the name of the diagnosis.
Your car's alternator falls outside a standard deviation either side of...
Well, that's exactly right. It's only producing 11 volts instead of 12. So you've got to replace it.
Oh, my gosh. You made me think about... So a book was the author, Eliot, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the other author, The Dyslexia Debate. Did you read that book when it came out a few years ago? Well... I read it and I got a bit cranky because now it was a purely academic look at this thing we call dyslexia, And if I understood it right, they had pretty much the conversation you and I are having about, if we're talking about dyslexia, it was reading ability falling at a certain point on the lower end of a distribution. And what these two authors were saying was, okay, so if there's this line on this distribution and on one side of the line you have dyslexia and on the other side of the line you don't, what does that mean for who gets the help and who doesn't?
Yeah,
so
what does it mean for the kid that's just above?
That's right. So I understood it, but I thought it was going to confound the whole... was going to cause problems for the whole debate. But it just made me think of that. But I completely on board with that line stuff, but there has to be a line.
Yeah, there's got to be a line.
A medical model says there's a line between hypertension and not having hypertension. There's a line between being of a good weight for your height and a not good weight for your height.
Yeah, that's right. And you've got to draw a line somewhere, and that line is based on evidence.
Ordered, like disordered.
If someone falls below this line, then it's deviated too far from the norm.
Yes.
And so we need to put something in place, to support that person to try and, shift it.
So it's not perfect, this line on a distribution, which pretty much runs and dictates a lot of who gets what in our community, but it is what it is. Yeah,
it's not a perfect system.
No. Right.
And so kind of for me that's the difference, is that, that disorder doesn't sit well with me. Before I was saying there's two perspectives. One is what you like to use and one is what the official terminology is. So I accept it's the official terminology, but I don't use it because I don't feel disordered. I don't feel like there's something wrong with me.
Michael, you're one of the most ordered people I know.
Yeah, so... And then there's the social, then there's the human rights model of disability, whatever you want to call it, which I think I subscribe to, which really says that everyone has a right.
Yeah.
So I'm a person.
Yes.
So I've got a right to an education.
Yes.
I've got a right to be able to read, learn to read and learn to write. That's my human right. And so I like that approach because it doesn't draw a line in the sand anywhere. There's no line. The line is underneath all of humanity.
Yes.
To say we all need to have this right to do this. I really like that model.
I like it too.
That says, well, let's get rid of discrimination altogether by saying we're all human.
Yeah.
So we all have these rights and let's do our best to make sure everyone achieves them.
That's well put, my friend. I like that.
I like it too. Well, that's how I like to think of it.
Okay. Well, I don't know whether we've given the listener really anything but probably food for thought about, whether you use the term disorder, disability or difference. But no, actually difference, well, I think we could, if there was a bin in here, we've put difference in the bin, haven't we?
Yeah, I don't like difference.
For specific learning difficulties anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, if I was to think what to take away from this is that it's confusing. So you've been doing this for a long time, Bill, much longer than me, and yet you're still debating in your head and learning every day and thinking, what do I call this? What is a learning disability? What is a learning difference? It's really complicated. And I think it's complicated because we're trying to draw a line on something that is a spectrum.
Something just occurred to me. Hang on, we've said disability, disorder, difference, and then I said specific learning difficulty because SLD. So I pulled in difficulty as well. We didn't mean to.
Yeah. I like difficulty personally.
Yeah.
And it is used a lot.
And someone would say, though, in a school that's not subscribing to science of reading, that doesn't have a good intervention program for kids who are not developing typically, they'd go, well, there are going to be schools that where that difficulty is much more pronounced than others for kids.
Yep.
So there's a big moving line, isn't it? The quality of the education. But anyway, look.
Yeah, so it is confusing. And, I was doing a little bit of research before we were looking at this podcast because I was thinking, is there a definition out there?
Yeah.
And, I was looking at all these expert opinions.
Yes.
And kind of this, the expert opinions that I got were that it's complicated.
Yes, that's
and
right.
It's not cut and dried. And
Nothing's
and so
easy.
if you're a parent out there or you're a teacher, and you're thinking, this is confusing, I don't quite understand it. Well, I think everyone's in that boat.
Yeah,
like everyone is a bit confused about it, and unless you subscribe to one particular model and say, that's my model and here's where I'm drawing the line.
I don't think how an intelligent person could do that.
So it is quite confusing.
Yeah.
But for me, I think if you go on your gut feeling about a situation and you think, okay, this kid's struggling.
Yeah.
Something's not right here.
Yes.
Like my kid's not learning to read, or they're not writing correctly.
And there's no apparent cognitive reason that should be so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then I think you should get an assessment.
Yeah.
Because
if you can.
If you can.
Yeah.
And if you can't get an assessment, then what do you do?
Okay, on assessment, in the DSM, the current DSM, they don't name dyslexia.
No, they don't.
Well, it's that broad what is it? What is it actually called in the DSM?
Learning. It was one of those Ds.
Reading and or spelling and but it's not.
It's the medical one. What's the medical term called again?
Oh, disorder.
Disorder.
Yeah, right.
A disorder in reading, reading, writing, and mathematics, I think.
We actually have the DSM in front of us, don't we? But dyslexia not named. That upset a lot of people when this is the DSM-5, isn't it?
Yep.
When that came out.
The most recent one.
Yeah. And they also threw out Asperger's syndrome too while they were at it. Which also upset a whole different community, and I think probably rightly. But anywho.
But people can still use it.
Yes, that's right.
You know what I mean? We don't have to stick with the medical model.
No, we don't. When I see educational assessments for kids, I immediately, my litmus test to does this person understand SLDs is, have they named it dyslexia? Have they used that term or dyscalculia or dysgraphia, or have they stuck safely to that broad DSM? And I, and not, there are a lot of ed psychs who don't name it, and I think it needs to be named because it then localises that set of difficulties, to use Sally Shaywitz's beautiful metaphor, as a island of difficulties in a sea of strengths. I think you need to focus down, but it takes a very experienced ed psych who's had a long time assessing kids to be able to confidently say, I'm going to call it dyslexia because of A, B, and C.
Yes.
Because I've seen thousands and thousands of kids and profiles over the years, and I've got the runs on the board to name it.
Yeah. So I think just getting back to what do you do if you can't get an assessment?
Well,
you know what I think? Like, as a specialist tutor, and you're a specialist tutor, I have kids that I work with that have not had an assessment or an identification, and I think that's fine because these kids don't learn differently. They learn the same. You don't suddenly magically learn differently when you have an identification of dyslexia. You're just a person, and you learn like everyone else,
just at a different pace with many more exposures needed.
So if a kid's struggling with reading or mathematics or spelling or writing, and they don't have an identification or a diagnosis, there's nothing wrong with finding a specialist tutor and working with them.
All right then. So
you don't have to have it.
No, you don't, but I work with lots of kids in pairs. And let's just say one, and I'm always, part of what we do is something they call academic therapy, which is sometimes just explaining to a kid why they're struggling in this moment, why they are having such difficulty with that one syllable CVC word that just at the moment won't come to them. And I would say things like, that's just those sounds jumping around and muddling, and that's dyslexia.
Yeah.
But if the other kid on the other side of the table hasn't got that identification, but I know it's dyslexia, what do I do?
Well, I'm in that circumstance, and I don't use the word dyslexia. Why don't I do it? Well, because I do have some kids whose parents don't want them to be labelled. They've specifically said, no, I'm not going to get an assessment.
That never lasts
because I don't want to label.
I go too late. They've labelled themselves. I think we need to go there.
And so I just talk about it from a purely functional perspective. So rather than using the word dyslexia, I say, well, you're having trouble with this because you're finding it tricky to break apart those sounds in your head and, you know, match them up with the letters.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I just sort of talk about it in the moment of,
That's probably not a bad way to
this is
start.
just what's happening.
Yeah.
Just like if we use the tennis analogy,
Yeah.
your serves are going out because you're not throwing the ball high enough.
No. You've got a phonological core deficit, which makes it really hard for your brain to play with sounds, speech sounds to be. Yeah, right. Well, I suppose, look, these kids are not thick. You know, I think you can. I talk to my kids about PHON, phon, sound, phoneme, phonics, phonological deficit, and the Phoenician alphabet, which we. So you can talk to kids and explain. So if you've got a phonological core deficit, what that means is your brain has a lot of trouble with sounds.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, it's controversial, and if we've got anything from this conversation, different labels work in different contexts. Some work in a context that is more political, when you're basically looking for money or funding for something.
Yeah.
Some work better in a context when you're talking to parents or kids about the difficulties and you don't want to crush souls,
Yep.
but you want to be frank and open about the difficulties.
Yeah, they need to know what's going on.
Yes.
And that there's a name for it and that it's not stupidity.
No, and I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Because like we talked about earlier, we're not dealing with kids that have general issues of understanding or language comprehension. They're bright kids. So it's this balance around, look, this is what this thing is, and this is how you can expect it to bring your difficulty. But there's a way around it.
Yeah, I say to my kids, you're certified smart.
Yeah.
Because they've had a psychological assessment.
Yes.
And you can't get a diagnosis of dyslexia, dyscalculia, the DISs, unless it's an unexpected
That's right.
difference in your learning.
Correct.
And so they're actually certified smart, and I say to them, look, you've got the piece of paper to prove it. Mm-hmm. You're actually really smart.
Mark Lemessurier used to say to me, he'd say, this is what I say to kids, you have to make your mind up. Now, this is controversial the way you put it, but I've never had it go badly. You've got to make your mind up. You're either dumb or you're dyslexic, because you cannot be both at the same time. So that's one I've fallen back on a fair bit.
So we're talking about dyslexia now, aren't we?
We are.
So that's the podcast next week.
That's right. So, look, thank you for listening. We really hope what we said was helpful and not utterly misleading, Michael. If you want to check out any of the references we've given, or you want to follow us on socials, that's how the kids say it, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah,
socials.
I reckon they do. Well done.
I just completely wrecked the coolness when I turned to you and said that's what the kids say.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I think you're right.
You'll find us on dyscastia.com. That's dyscastia.com, where you'll find more information and of course, all of our other episodes. Now, next week, Michael, we're going to continue our discussion on learning difficulties, and we'll talk in more detail about dyslexia and dysgraphia.
Yeah, excellent.
So we really hope you'll lend us your ear then.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.